Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the seals and trumpets, those two types of judgments in Revelation chapter 6 through 11, our continuing study of end times prophecy. We looked at chapters 1 through 3, where we had a vision of Jesus, and he is telling John to write 7 letters to 7 specific churches. Then we came to chapter 4, where he is in the spirit, and he has this vision caught up to heaven itself. He sees God upon the throne and a scroll, and as the scroll is seen, it is sealed with 7 seals, and the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Lamb standing as though slain, in other words, Jesus, is shown to have the authority to open the seals. As we come to chapter 6, the first seal opens. With the seals, the first 4 seals introduce 4 horses, a white horse, a black horse, a red horse, and a horse that's been alternately translated as either pale or green, sickly, in other words. And each of the 4 horses represent an activity that's taking place on earth. And as we read this, we've seen this picture before, this idea of 4 horsemen. That goes back to Zechariah chapter 1, where Zechariah had seen a vision of 4 horsemen with different colored horses. And he was told back then, those are the ones that God sent out to patrol the earth, and they patrol the earth, and they come back, and everything is peaceful and quiet. Now, as John sees these 4 horsemen go forth, the earth is not peaceful and quiet. It's the polar opposite of peaceful and quiet. There's wars, there's inflation, there's disease, there's sickness, there's death, all sorts of bad things happening. It's troubled times, and indeed, in his day, there were troubled times. Now, we come to chapter 6, verse 9, when the Lamb broke the 5th seal. The first 4 seals are these horsemen. The 5th seal I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Lord, when are you going to make things right? When are you going to pass judgment? Now, souls under the altar. Remember, you had 2 altars in the temple. You had the big giant altar out in front of the temple. That's where sacrifices were made. That's not this altar. You had the altar inside the temple, the altar of incense. That represented the prayers of God's people. And here is a representation of the prayers, but in this case, these people have died. They have been slain. And they're saying, Lord, notice their prayers go up. Are you going to, is judgment now going to take place? How long is it going to be? So remember, the disciples were saying, When's it going to be? Are we there yet? Here is a picture of those who have died and are asking essentially the same question. How long? Are we there yet? And so that's the 5th seal. The martyrs pray to God for justice. And then we turn to the 6th seal, which is the answer to the prayer in the 5th seal. In the 6th seal, we have this vision of unbelievers, and they're praying too, but they're praying not to God. They're praying to the mountains and rocks to hide them. Look at that, chapter 6, verse 12. I looked when he broke the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. You say, is this figurative? Is this literal? Remember, some of these things happened when Jesus was crucified. There was an earthquake, and the sun grew dark. So I tend to look at, gee, maybe this isn't just some sort of figurative element that is a picture of God's anger. Maybe it's that, but maybe it's more than that. Verse 14, the sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Then the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the commanders, and the rich, and the strong, but not only the rich, strong kings, but also every slave and free man, that in other words, everyone, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, and here's their prayer, not to God, but to the rocks and to the mountains, fall on us, hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So this picture of the kings and the commanders and the high and mighty and even the down and lowly, all hiding in caves. Now, it reminds me a little bit, and maybe it's supposed to, of Joshua chapter 10. Remember the instance where the sun stands still and the moon stops its movement? That's in Joshua chapter 10. But at the end of that chapter, we find out that the kings that had been fighting against the Israelites, against God's people, had gone and hidden themselves in a series of caves. And they were caught. The caves did not protect them. The prayer was not answered. And here again, this picture where they're trying to hide in caves from the wrath of the Lamb. Now, if they're hiding from the wrath of the Lamb, that just assumes the Lamb has come. That sounds like Jesus showed up, and the day of wrath is there. And who's able to stand? And it's a rhetorical question. The answer is nobody. Now you turn the page to chapter 7, and you have a reference to 144,000 from the different tribes of Israel, and you're actually given a rundown of the different, 12,000 from this tribe, 12,000 from that tribe. Sort of interesting. The tribes don't quite line up to the tribes that we know of, but that's okay. So I think it might be a bit stylized. For example, there's a tribe of Joseph. There wasn't a tribe of Joseph, and then you see Ephraim mentioned. So it's not quite the tribes as we know them, but John hears the counting of the tribes. Now remember what we saw in the past, where he would hear a sound of a trumpet, and he'd turn and he would see Jesus, or he'd hear about the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he would turn around and see the Lamb. And here he hears about the 144,000. And then we see in verse 9, and after these things I looked, he turns and he looks, and behold, you expect to see 144,000. Instead, we read, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and people and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes. And palm branches were in their hands, and they cry out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And notice the 144,000 have turned into, that's a representative sampling. They represent everyone, this great multitude, this huge group from every nation, tribes, people, tongues, all languages, standing before the Lord. So this introduces now 7 trumpets. And now I have the first 6 because the 7th is going to introduce the next set. In the first trumpet, there's hail and fire and blood, and a third of the earth is burned up. The second trumpet, a mountain is cast into the sea, and a third of the sea, notice that third of the sea turns into blood. The third trumpet, a star, it crashes upon the rivers, and a third of the rivers are burned up. And the fourth trumpet sounds, and the sun, moon, and stars, sort of reminds me of the fourth day when the sun, moon, and stars were formed in creation. But this is the opposite of creation. This is decreation. And a third of the sky is darkened. A third of the light givers are darkened. The fifth trumpet sounds, and these locusts, and they are weird-looking locusts. I don't think we're talking about literal locusts with hair and things like that. They are representative of something, and men are tormented by that. And then the sixth trumpet, 4 angels are released, and a third of mankind is killed. Notice all the thirds that are mentioned in each of these. Those first 4 sound very much like a judgment upon creation, where all of these things are hitting God's creation, and then numbers 5 and 6 are a judgment upon, specifically described upon men, that they are tormenting people. Now, I'm not saying that people don't get tormented in these other things too, but they're specifically oriented in that direction. And so you have these 7 seals that we'd already seen back in chapter 6. Now are 7 trumpets with the seals. Remember how it began with a group of 4 horsemen? With the 7 trumpets, it begins with that group of 4 judgments against the creation. With the 7 seals, the martyred saints under the altar cry out to the Lord in the 5th seal, asking when the judgment will come. And in the 5th and 6th trumpet judgments, they are focused, we said, upon mankind specifically. With the opening of the 6th seal, unbelievers seek to hide themselves from the wrath of the Lamb. Likewise, at the sounding of the 7th trumpet, we're going to see the final judgment of all men. So, 6th seal sound, we said it sounded a lot like Jesus came. When we get to the sounding of the 7th trumpet, I think we're going to see the same thing. That doesn't mean he comes in another time. I think it's another look at God's judgment followed by Jesus comes. That's what's going to happen at the end. Now we come to chapter 11 and verse 1, and this is after the sixth trumpets, but before the seventh. Then there was given me a measuring rod like a staff. And someone said, get up and measure the temple of God and the altar. Now, I think can't say this for sure. If John's being told to go out and measure the temple, that would presuppose that there's a temple to be measured. And of course, the question is he measuring the temple in Jerusalem? Was that still standing? Or is this a heavenly temple? Let's continue looking. Get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship it. Leave out the court which is outside the temple and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. That 42 is going to be significant. We're going to look at that. And this idea, remember, the temple actually had an outer court known as the court of the Gentiles, because Gentiles were allowed there. Notice that becomes symbolic here of something, what we're going to see in a minute. So here's a picture. Actually, this is a model of the temple. This model is at the Scroll Museum in Jerusalem. And you can see that low outer wall on the bottom of, well, first of all, there's one at the very bottom on the left bottom. But notice on the right bottom of your screen that stretches alongside those temple structures. The wall was about 4 or 5 feet tall, with signs every so often that said, no Gentile past this point upon pain of death. Gentiles were allowed outside that wall, but into those inner courts, those were Jews only, and that represents a division, something that's taking place. Preterists take this passage to be the literal temple. They think it speaks of the literal first century temple that was destroyed by Titus, and it was about to be destroyed, and so it's being measured. And they look at the 42 months, and that's about how long the Jewish War for Independence was. From the time they declared their independence, and they actually said, this is now year one. We're starting the calendar over again. And to 70 AD, when that began around 66 AD, and by 70 AD, the temple was destroyed by the Roman general Titus. And they say, see, that was fulfilled there. And that actually they might have a point here. I'm not saying Jesus came back after that, but I think there might be a point there that is at least symbolized here. Now, the symbolic, and I'm not sure that we have to choose one or the other, might be a combination, sees the symbol of the temple referring to God's people, which it did. It did. Remember that this is said again and again and again in the New Testament. I think you can even find it in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament it specifically says he's building up us, the people of God, as a temple of God, not just individually, but also collectively. As we are brought together, we become the temple. And so, is this literal? Is this symbolic? With regard to symbolism, all throughout, going back to the days of the prophet Daniel and some of the things that he prophesied, going back to the days of the Maccabees and the time when the temple was desecrated, that the idea of 42 months was symbolic in a number of cases, not just one. We're going to look at a number of them where this was a time of testing. And so that had become sort of a symbol, just like we might say, somebody going through his, it was like having World War II. And, we might use that as an expression. We're not saying literally we were dropping atomic bombs or anything like that, but that it becomes symbolic of a great struggle, of a great time of trouble. And then, of course, the futurists, and the futurist doesn't have to point anything in the past because he's a futurist. The futurists often believe that there will be a literal future temple that will be rebuilt before Christ returns in his final second coming, that this is a literal temple. Notice how the preterists and the futurists sort of have some agreement there. And furthermore, they believe regularly that 42 months into the tribulation period, that there will be something where the Antichrist comes and sets up a statue of himself and worships. And of course, that already happened. And let me just say, the futurists do not deny that's already happened. They know their history. It happened first with Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC, where a Greek king came into the temple in Jerusalem and set up a statue of himself. And it happened again. Now, it wasn't with a statue per se, but it was with you could call it an abomination of desolation, where Titus went in to the temple, actually had it burned to the ground, and then built a pagan altar on the site of the Holy of Holies, and they worship, the pagan gods there. And to make matters worse, later on in the next century, there was a Roman emperor by the name of Hadrian who actually commanded, let's build a temple to Zeus on the site of the Jerusalem temple. Now that didn't happen. A revolt broke out, and there was all sorts of war, and it was never built. But if you go to Jerusalem today, on the site of the Temple Mount, there is this big giant structure standing there right this minute, called the Dome of the Rock. And I don't mean to be mean here, but it renders it desolate to Jewish worship. Jewish worshipers are not allowed there. I'm not sure they would go even if they were allowed, because there is what they would consider an abomination that renders it desolate, standing on the site of the holy place. Now, the temple, so far in the book of Revelation, the temple's mentioned in a number of places. We already saw that the lampstand, and we didn't have to guess, we didn't have to make this up. We were told back in Revelation chapter 1, the lampstand represents the churches, the 7 lamps, 7 churches. And the overcomer, one of the promises of those 7 churches, he who overcomes will be a pillar in the temple of his God. Now, that's not, you don't become a literal pillar, it's not like you're going to turn to stone, but that's symbolic of God's living temple. And then chapter 7, verse 15, the ones coming out of great tribulation will serve the Lord day and night in his heavenly temple. That means that we're not talking about someplace on earth, a heavenly temple. And then the Ark of the Covenant, when we get to toward the end of chapter 11, in verse 19, suddenly John sees a vision where he sees the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant hadn't been seen by anybody since the days of Jeremiah. Jeremiah had actually prophesied it's going to be lost and not seen again, and nobody's going to see it or hear from it. And sure enough, no one has seen the Ark of the Covenant. There have been a few claims. I don't believe them. Let me just say. And it hasn't been seen, but John sees the Ark of the Covenant, Revelation chapter 11, verse 19, which in the temple which is in heaven. So each one of the references to the temple so far, including in this chapter, have been of something not in Jerusalem, but in heaven. And then finally, we're going to read in Revelation chapter 21, verse 22, when we get there, that the Lord and the Lamb are the temple in the New Jerusalem. Now, chapter 11, verse 3, and I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses. And it's at this point that speculation often runs rampant. Who are the 2 witnesses? Notice, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days. We're going to see that number, both described as 3.5 years or 42 months or 1,260 days. It's all basically the same period. Clothed in sackcloth, and then it tells us, you say, who are these? These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And you're supposed to say, oh, I remember who that is. Now, we don't usually do that because we don't know our Old Testament that well. But if we did, we say, I remember that. That's in Zechariah chapter 3 and chapter 4. In chapter 3, that's Joshua, not Joshua like from Moses' day, but Joshua the high priest. And chapter 4, that's Zerubbabel. And in both cases, they represent the people of God. The priests represented the people of God. And Zerubbabel, who was the descendant of David, also represented, he was a governor, he represented the people of God. Now, here it is, Zechariah chapter 4, beginning in verse 2, where Zechariah, actually an angel says to Zechariah, what do you see? And I said, I see and behold a lampstand, all of gold, with its bowl on the top of it, and its 7 lamps on it with 7 spouts, belonging to each of the lamps which are on the top of it. Also 2 olive trees by it, one on the right side of the bowl, one on its left. It's interesting. We've actually found this ornament that sounds remarkably, it's not identical. It's not that thing, but it reminds us of that, of a ornament that had a lamp, and the lamp had these little oil containers on either side, notice, displayed as though they are people. It's all part of the ornament, and they feed the oil into the lamp itself. That sounds remarkably like this vision of what Zechariah sees. So there's both a lampstand and two olive trees, and of course, the idea of the olive trees is they provide the olive oil to keep the lamp lit, and it's a symbol. Zechariah goes on to say that it's a symbol of God's people. Now, the time elements we mentioned, chapter 11, verse 2 mentions 42 months. We just read 1,260 days. When we get to chapter 11, verse 9, we have a reference to 3.5 days. Now, that's different, that's days, but notice the 3.5. And then there's another reference to 3.5, and then 1,260 days again, and then 42 months, which equals basically 1,260 days. So you have these references, some in days, some in hundreds of days, some just in 3.5 days. But they're all sort of the way they're seen is in this patterned approach to describing them. Now, that scene, it's a reference back to the Old Testament. Elijah, you remember, prayed, and it didn't rain for 3.5 years. And then there was the Assyrians who besieged Samaria for 3.5 years before its fall. Finally fell in 721 BC. Then there was Jerusalem that was dominated, we've already mentioned, for 3.5 years by the forces of Antiochus the Fourth, Antiochus Epiphanes, and finally he was driven out, and the temple was restored after this. So this was actually dealing with the temple. Then the ministry of Jesus. Now I put a question mark because we're never specifically told in the Gospels how long was the ministry of Jesus. John's account mentions at least three Passovers, maybe, and then there's a fourth unnamed feast. And so people have commonly thought that's 3.5 years. But I want to leave the question mark because I'm not sure about that. But then Nero's persecution of the Christians is going to last for 3.5 years, at the end of which he will commit suicide. And then finally, we already mentioned the Jewish revolt against Rome was 3.5 years. So all of these different time elements of the same length of time signifying a time of great trial, a time of great trouble, a time of great tribulation. And so we're going to stop here and we'll pick up next time. But we've seen, notice the visions of Jesus in the seven letters to seven churches, and each one ended with a promise of the second coming, where Jesus comes back. And then chapters 4 through 7, we saw the picture of the throne of God and the scroll and the seven seals. And at the end of that period, Christ wipes away every tear. That sounds like Jesus comes back. And then in chapter 8 through 11, we have this vision of the seven trumpets. Then finally, we get to chapter 11, verse 15, and we read that Christ will reign forever and ever. And that sounds to me like Jesus comes back. Not that he comes back again and again and again, but that each of these is a picture, sort of like going to an art studio and seeing a whole art collection on a common theme. Each one shows a picture of Jesus, and that he is going to return. And when he does, he will win and make all things right. And we'll continue to see that pattern no matter what your prophetic view. I think we'll continue to see the pattern throughout the rest of the book, but we'll continue that study next time.